It was Mother's Day when he finally came home. The knock on the door felt both familiar and strange, like a song I hadn't heard in years. I wiped my hands on my old apron and opened it, and there he was, my son, dressed sharp as ever, with a watch that gleamed brighter than the morning sun. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but I pretended not to notice. He handed me a bouquet that still had the store tag tucked under the ribbon. We sat down at the same table where I used to serve him oatmeal before school. The air felt heavy with words neither of us wanted to say. Then, as he sipped from his silver flask and glanced around my small kitchen, he asked, "Mom, are you happy with the 5,000 Clara sends you every month?" My heart stilled. I looked down at my trembling hands, then met his eyes and said softly, "Son, the church is keeping me alive these days." And just as those words left my lips, I heard the sound of heels clicking down the hall. His wife stepped in, elegant and cold, holding a glass of champagne like it belonged more than I did in that room. Thank you so much for watching my story, my dear ones. Before we go on, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so please tell me down below. I always enjoy hearing where hearts connect from. My name is Hazel, and I live out here in Utah, surrounded by quiet hills and the kind of sunsets that make you feel small but thankful. I've lived in this same house for more than 40 years. Through laughter, through loss, through every change that life can bring. This home holds memories in every corner. From the marks on the kitchen wall where my son's height was once measured, to the smell of cinnamon that never seems to leave the air, no matter how many years pass. I raised him here, just the two of us after his father passed, and every inch of this place carries a piece of our story. When I close my eyes, I can still see him running across this old wooden floor with his school shoes untied, shouting about his dreams of becoming someone important. And I believed he would, because I knew his heart, or at least I thought I did. Life back then wasn't easy. Not for a single mother trying to build a future out of night shifts and secondhand faith. I worked as a nurse for 27 years, tending to patients who called me an angel, even when my own feet ached so badly I could barely walk home. On weekends, I cleaned houses, polished floors, washed windows, and told myself it was all worth it if it meant he'd never have to struggle like I did. When he got accepted into college, I cried harder than I did at my own wedding. That was the moment I thought all the sleepless nights and sacrifices had meaning. Every dollar I saved, every prayer I whispered, every tear I swallowed, it all went into giving him wings. For a long time, I thought I'd succeeded. He graduated with honors, started working for a big firm in New York, and sent me pictures of office buildings that touched the sky. I kept those photos in a small frame beside my bed, not because I cared about the money he made, but because they reminded me of hope, of how far we'd come from those nights when we shared soup and laughter instead of comfort and rest. But slowly, things changed. The phone calls came less often, the visits stopped completely. Birthdays became text messages, holidays became checks with his name printed neatly at the bottom. It was like I'd raised a man who loved the memory of his mother, but forgot the woman still living behind it. I tried to tell myself he was just busy, that maybe this was how life worked when success knocked. I even told the ladies at church that my boy was doing fine, and that he'd been so generous sending me money each month. They'd smile and say, "Hazel, you raised him well," and I'd smile back, pretending the envelopes always came. What I didn't tell them was that for 3 months straight I hadn't seen a dime. I stretched every can of soup, sold my old sewing machine, and learned to survive on what the church pantry could spare. I didn't want pity, only peace, and the strength to believe that maybe he'd remember me one day. Not as someone he owed, but as someone he loved. That Mother's Day morning, when I saw him at my door, I felt a wave of hope I hadn't felt in years. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something else. Distance, confusion, maybe guilt. I could tell he'd come because something inside him had started to whisper that maybe it was time to check on the woman who once built his world from scratch. I didn't expect much that day. Just a little warmth, maybe a moment of truth. But as the day went on, I realized that the truth can come quietly, wrapped in words that cut deep, and sometimes it takes losing something to remember who you used to be. When I think back on my life, It feels like a long road paved with quiet prayers and small victories that nobody else ever saw. My son was my reason for everything, from the moment I first held him to the nights when exhaustion nearly broke me. I was only 23 when I lost his father in a car accident, and from that day forward, it was just the two of us against the world. We didn't have much, but what we had, we shared. Faith, laughter, and a promise that no matter how hard life got, we would never give up on each other. I remember sitting on the porch after long shifts, my uniform still smelling like disinfectant, watching him sleep through the window, and whispering, "One day, you'll have the life I never did." And for a long time, I thought that prayer had been answered. He was always so bright, always dreaming bigger than the rest. He'd sit at the table solving math problems while I packed lunches for the children of other families, whispering to myself that someday, all this would mean something. I kept every report card, every thank you note from his teachers, even the drawings he made with crayons that I couldn't bear to throw away. My whole world revolved around his future. When he got that scholarship, I thought the hard part was over. I didn't realize that distance has a way of creeping in slowly, not through anger, but through silence. College changed him, or maybe success did. I'm still not sure. At first he'd call every weekend, then once a month. Then only when he needed something signed or sent. I'd sit by the phone sometimes, holding my breath at every ring, only to hear a telemarketer's voice instead. Still, I stayed proud. I told myself it was what parents do. They raise their children to fly, even if that means watching them disappear into the clouds. When he graduated, he looked so handsome standing there in his suit, shaking hands with men who would shape his future. I remember that moment clearer than most days since. I was the woman sitting in the back row, clapping until my hands hurt, too shy to shout but too proud to cry. I wanted to believe that no matter where life took him, I'd still be part of his world. But slowly, I became more like a postcard memory than a person he visited. His letters became emails, his voice became an occasional text. And his care came in the form of money that didn't always arrive. It's strange how pride can keep you quiet. There were nights I'd go to bed hungry, but still smile when someone mentioned his name, pretending that I was fine. I thought I was being strong, but now I know that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just pain folded neatly between breaths. When he stopped visiting, I tried to fill the emptiness with church gatherings, volunteer work, anything that reminded me I still mattered to someone. And yet, every Mother's Day, I'd set the table for two. One plate for me, one for him, just in case he came. Most years that seat stayed empty, but I never stopped hoping. Hope is a stubborn thing, especially for a mother who still sees the little boy inside the man. That's why when he showed up this time, standing there in his polished shoes, I didn't know whether to cry or pretend that everything was normal. I could see he'd built a life filled with comfort, but something about him looked lost. Maybe it was guilt, maybe regret, but for the first time in years, I felt like he was seeing me, not as a distant obligation, but as the woman who once held his world together. I told myself to stay calm, to let him talk, because sometimes the truth finds its way through the cracks, and when it does, it changes everything. When he stepped into my home that morning, it was like watching a memory walk through the door. Only quieter, colder, and far too polite. He looked around slowly, as though he was seeing the place for the first time, his eyes landing on the faded curtains, the chipped dishes, and the small cross above the kitchen doorway that had hung there since he was a boy. I could feel the space between us stretching wider with every second, filled with the ghosts of all the things we hadn't said over the years. He smiled faintly and asked about the church, about the neighbors, about my health, the kind of questions people ask when they're trying to avoid the truth. I answered gently, but each word I spoke carried years of longing and unspoken pain. I poured him a cup of tea, the same way I used to, careful not to spill, hoping he'd taste something familiar in it. But he didn't drink much, just kept staring at the steam rising from the cup as if searching for courage inside it. After a while, he leaned back, crossed his legs, and asked again, this time slower. "Mom, Clara's been sending you the money, right?" I froze for a moment, trying to find the right words, because I knew that whatever I said next would change something between us. I could have lied, could have smiled and told him everything was fine, but I was too tired of pretending. I met his eyes and said softly, "The church has been feeding me most weeks. I haven't seen a cent in months." His face changed, just slightly at first, confusion flickering into disbelief. Before he could say another word, I heard her voice, light, practiced, and distant, floating in from the hallway. Then came the sound of heels, sharp and deliberate, crossing my worn floorboards like they owned the place. She entered the room with a glass of champagne in one hand and her phone in the other, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, she's being dramatic again," she said, laughing lightly as she rested her hand on his shoulder. I sat still, watching her, not angry yet, just numb. I had always tried to accept her, even when she never really tried to accept me. I remembered the first time I met her, how she looked me up and down as if she was assessing an old piece of furniture that didn't quite fit her taste. Still, I told myself to stay kind, to stay calm, because she was part of my son's life, and that meant I had to make room for her in mine. But in that moment, as I looked at her standing there, perfectly polished and utterly careless, I realized that she'd done more than come between us. She had built a wall so tall that he couldn't even see me on the other side. My son didn't laugh at her comment. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling, his fingers trembling slightly. The silence between us felt heavy, the kind that makes your heart race because you know something is about to break. He called his bank, his voice low but firm. I sat there, hands folded, listening to the hum of his conversation, the way he said my name when explaining the situation, and the shock that crept into his tone when the truth came out. Clara had been transferring the money to another account, one belonging to her parents. My chest ached, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of what I had already felt deep down, that love without honesty is just performance, and kindness without truth is nothing more than decoration. When he ended the call, he looked at me differently. Not as a mother to pity, but as a woman who deserved better. I didn't gloat. I didn't cry. I just whispered, "Now you know why I said the church is keeping me alive." He looked like a man caught between two worlds, one built on appearances and one built on truth. I could tell that everything he thought he knew about his life had just shifted. And as for me, I sat there quietly, knowing that sometimes the only way light enters a room is through the crack in a lie. After the call ended and the truth finally hung between us, the room fell into a stillness that I'll never forget. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels calm. It was the kind that presses down on your chest until you can hear your own heartbeat. My son sat there, staring at nothing, his jaw tight, the phone still in his hand. I could tell he was fighting disbelief, trying to make sense of what he'd just learned. The woman he trusted, the one he'd built a life with, had been quietly draining the love he thought he was giving. I wanted to reach for his hand, but I didn't. Some lessons need the ache to sink in before comfort can help. Clara broke that silence first. She laughed lightly, the way people do when they think charm will fix the damage. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice smooth as the silk dress she wore. "Your mother must have misunderstood. I was helping my parents for a little while. You said I could manage the accounts." My son didn't look at her, didn't even blink. He just said quietly, "You stole from her." That was when her face hardened. The mask slipped, and beneath it was someone who didn't see what she'd done as betrayal, only inconvenience. "It's not like she needs it," she snapped. "She lives alone, she doesn't go anywhere, and the church feeds her for free. Why do you think I kept sending money to her name at all? It was to keep appearances, to make you feel generous." Her words sliced through the air like glass. I didn't speak. I'd spent too many years holding my tongue, too many years trying to be the calm in every storm. My son turned toward me then, his eyes full of regret, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who once promised me that no matter how successful he became, he'd always come home. "Mom," he whispered, voice trembling, "I'm so sorry." I shook my head gently. "Don't be sorry for loving the wrong person," I said. "Be grateful that you saw the truth before it was too late." She rolled her eyes, grabbed her purse, and muttered something under her breath about ungrateful people and small houses. The sound of her heels echoed down the hallway as she walked out, her perfume lingering like smoke. My son didn't move for a while. He just sat there, his hands covering his face, his world crumbling quietly around him. I wanted to tell him that money could be replaced, that betrayal could heal, but I knew it wasn't my place to fix it this time. Some hearts have to rebuild themselves without their mother's hands guiding the pieces back together. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, tired, but steady. I thought success meant protecting everyone, he said, but I forgot that you can't protect people who lie to you. I looked at him, and even though my heart ached for all the years we'd lost, I also felt something shift, a small, fragile thread of hope weaving itself back into the space between us. Sometimes truth doesn't destroy what's left of love, it just burns away what never belonged there in the first place. As he stood to leave, he turned toward me one last time and said, "I'll make this right." I didn't ask how, I didn't need to. I just smiled, tired but proud, and said, "Just remember, love isn't money sent through an account, it's time spent across a table." And for the first time in years, he nodded like he understood exactly what that meant. The days that followed were quiet. Almost too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath after what had happened. My son came by again 2 mornings later, this time without his suit jacket, looking more like the boy I remembered and less like the man the world had built. He brought groceries, simple things like milk, bread, and a jar of my favorite jam, the kind he used to eat straight from the spoon when he was little. We unpacked the bags together in silence, the kind that isn't heavy anymore, just tender. When we finally sat down, he asked if I had anyone helping me lately, and I told him about Sister Mary from the church. She wasn't just a friend, she was a light that never dimmed. She'd been visiting every week, bringing meals, medicine, and sometimes just company when the walls felt too loud. It was Sister Mary who noticed the unopened envelopes on my table a few weeks ago, the ones with bank logos printed neatly in the corner. I told her they were just receipts, nothing important, but she had that way of seeing through things. She said, "Hazel, sometimes God sends proof before he sends justice." I didn't understand it then, but now I see she was right. Those envelopes became the very thing that opened my son's eyes. When I told him about it, he sat back in silence for a long moment, as if realizing how much of my world had gone unseen. I could tell he felt ashamed, but I didn't want shame between us. I just wanted honesty. He asked about the church, about the people there, and for the first time I saw curiosity instead of pity. I told him how the pastor checks on me every Thursday, how the choir girls make sure my heater works when the nights get cold, and how we pray not just for blessings but for strength. I told him that the church didn't just feed me, it reminded me I was still worth feeding. He looked down, his eyes glistening, and said, "You shouldn't have had to rely on anyone else, Mom." I smiled softly and said, "Sometimes, the help we get isn't failure, it's grace. And grace doesn't always come from where we expect." He nodded, but I could tell those words stayed with him afresh. It wasn't anger that I felt anymore, just peace, the kind that comes after truth settles the dust. Watching him that day, humbled and quiet, I realized something had shifted. The world had taken my son far away, but maybe this moment, this heartbreak, was the path that would bring him home again. That afternoon, after he left, I sat by the window with the curtains half open, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. I thought about everything that had been said, everything that had been lost, and how strange it felt to finally breathe without the weight of pretending. The truth had hurt, but it had also set something free inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Dignity. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, made myself a cup of tea, and decided I wouldn't hide anymore. I gathered the envelopes Sister Mary told me to keep, the ones with the proof inside, and placed them neatly in a small folder. I didn't do it out of anger or revenge, but because I wanted my son to see that I was not weak, that even without wealth, I still had strength left in me. Later that day, he came again, looking tired but different, as if the world he built had lost its shine overnight. He asked to see the documents, and I handed them to him without a word. He flipped through each page slowly, shaking his head as he realized how deep the betrayal went. When he was done, he looked up and said quietly, "You should have told me sooner." I smiled faintly and said, Some things you can't be told, you have to see for yourself. He nodded, his jaw tightening, then stood up and called his lawyer again, this time with a steady voice that carried no confusion, only purpose. I sat there, listening, not because I wanted justice for myself, but because I wanted to hear the sound of him taking charge of his own life again. When he hung up, he turned to me and said, "I'll make it right, I promise." I could see in his eyes that he meant it, but I also knew that no amount of money or apology could fix what had already been broken. Still, I told him softly, "Make it right, but not with money. Make it right with time." He looked down, tears filling his eyes, and whispered, "I will, Mom." It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real, and sometimes that's all the heart needs to start healing. As he left, I watched him from the window, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel left behind. I felt seen. The following morning, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing, something that rarely happened anymore. It was my son, his voice quiet but steady, asking if he could come by again. When he arrived, I could see the sleeplessness in his face, the way regret had settled into his eyes. He told me that he had spoken with his lawyer and the bank, that everything Clara had taken was being restored, and that her name had been removed from every account. I didn't ask for details, I didn't need to. I only cared that he was standing there, not as a stranger weighed down by pride, but as a man who had finally remembered where he came from. We sat together at the same table that had held so many unspoken moments, and for the first time in years, we spoke without walls. He told me he felt foolish, that he'd been blind, that success had made him see life like numbers instead of people. I listened, not to judge, but to let him empty the guilt that had built up for too long. Then he said, "I want to make sure you never go without again." I smiled and placed my hand on his, saying, "What I went without wasn't money, it was time. And time is all I want now." His eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. It was a small moment, but it carried more weight than any gift ever could. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a new set of keys, and slid them across the table toward me. "It's for a new house," he said, closer to me. I looked at those keys for a long while, feeling tears rise that I didn't bother to hide. "Thank you," I whispered. "But don't forget, love doesn't live in walls or doors, it lives in presence." He understood. I could see it. The hurt between us didn't vanish that day, but something began to heal, something quiet and true. As he stood to leave, he hugged me, not the polite kind of hug people give out of duty, but the kind that says, "I see you, I missed you, and I'm not leaving again." When the door closed behind him, I sat for a while holding the keys in my hand and realized that forgiveness isn't a moment, it's a choice you keep making every time your heart remembers the pain. And that day, I chose peace. A few weeks passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm that felt softer, warmer, almost familiar again. My son started visiting every weekend, no longer in tailored suits, but in simple shirts and old jeans that made him look younger somehow. He'd bring coffee and groceries, sometimes flowers from the market, and each time he came, the silence between us grew smaller. We talked more, laughed more, and little by little, I began to see the man he used to be, the one who used to call just to tell me he'd gotten home safe. The house felt alive again, not because of anything new, but because the air was filled with presence instead of distance. One Sunday, he came with paint cans and brushes, saying he wanted to fix the porch railing that had started to peel. Watching him work with his sleeves rolled up, I thought about all the years I'd spent wondering if he would ever come home, not out of guilt, but out of love. And now here he was, humming softly, wiping sweat from his brow, asking if I liked the color he'd chosen. I told him I did. Not because the color mattered, but because he was here, standing on the same porch where I used to wave him off to school. Sometimes I'd look at him and see the little boy in the man, and that was enough to make my heart rest easy. In the evenings, he'd sit with me by the window, and we'd talk about nothing in particular, weather, recipes, memories that still made us laugh. I noticed how different his voice sounded now, calmer, humbler, touched by gratitude instead of hurry. The world hadn't changed, but something inside him had, and that was worth more than all the wealth he could ever offer. One night before leaving, he kissed my forehead and said, "I didn't realize how much I missed this, Mom." I smiled, holding his hand for a moment, and whispered, "That's because love never leaves. It just waits for us to find our way back to it." And when he walked out into the cool night air, I knew this time he would come back, not out of obligation, but out of the quiet pull of love rediscovered. Time has a way of softening even the deepest ache, and as the weeks turned into months, the weight that once lived inside my chest began to lift little by little. My son kept his promise, not through grand gestures, but through simple, steady care. He called every morning before work just to ask how I slept, and on Sundays he never failed to show up with a smile and a story about his week. The house felt brighter again, not because the walls had changed, but because his laughter echoed through them like sunlight returning after a long storm. One evening, he told me that he'd started going to church, sitting quietly at the back pew, not to impress anyone, but to understand the peace he said he saw in me. Hearing that made me close my eyes for a moment, because it reminded me that love, when it's real, always finds its way home. Clara tried calling once, and though I could hear the regret in her voice, I didn't feel anger anymore. I simply told her that forgiveness wasn't for her to earn, it was mine to give, and I had already given it. I wished her well, not because she deserved it, but because bitterness would only keep me chained to what I had already survived. My son never mentioned her again, and I didn't ask. Some wounds don't need retelling, they just need time to close quietly. As summer turned to fall, I noticed how much calmer my life had become. I spent more afternoons with my church friends, laughing over coffee, feeling lighter than I had in years. Every now and then, my son would stop by unannounced, just to sit on the porch and watch the sunset with me. No expensive gifts, no formality, just presence, simple and honest. And as we sat side by side, I realized that redemption doesn't always come in grand apologies. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the sound of footsteps returning home, in the warmth of a hand reaching for yours, and in the peace that follows when love remembers its way back to the heart that never stopped waiting. Autumn deepened, and with it came a calm I hadn't known in years. The leaves outside my window turned the color of gold, and each one that fell reminded me that even endings can be beautiful when they come with peace. My son had kept his promise, not through wealth or gifts, but through presence. Every Sunday he'd show up early, bringing breakfast and a smile, and we'd sit together like we used to, our words flowing easily, our silences no longer heavy. Sometimes he'd fix something around the house, other times he'd just sit by the fire, listening as I talked about the church choir or the new recipes I'd been trying. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was love in its truest form, steady, simple, and real. One afternoon, as the wind picked up and the air smelled like rain, he told me he'd been thinking about starting fresh. He said he wanted to rebuild not just his home, but his heart. I looked at him, proud and quiet, and told him that rebuilding doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to grow from what hurt you. He smiled faintly and said, "I think I understand that now." Watching him that day, with humility softening his face, I realized how much he had changed. The arrogance that once shadowed him had melted away, replaced by something honest, something human. When he stood to leave, he hugged me tighter than usual and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled and whispered, "A mother's love doesn't give up, it just waits for the right time to be remembered." After he left, I stood by the window again, watching the rain trace paths down the glass, and I felt something warm in my chest. It wasn't pride or relief, it was gratitude. Gratitude that after all the distance, the silence, and the pain, love had found its way home, walking through the same door it once walked out of, carrying not money, not gifts, but understanding. And that, to me, was worth more than anything he could ever buy. Winter came quietly that year, wrapping the town in soft white, and slowing everything down to a pace that felt gentle, forgiving. My son still visited, bringing warm bread from the bakery and stories about work, though he spoke less about the city now, and more about the quiet moments that made him feel alive. We'd sit by the fire, and sometimes he'd ask questions about my past, things he'd never taken the time to know before. I told him about my first job as a nurse, about the nights I walked home in the snow, too tired to feel my fingers but proud that I'd made it through. He listened with a kind of attentiveness that made me forget the years of distance, as if he was trying to collect every missing piece of the woman he'd forgotten. One evening, he came with a letter in his hand and said he'd been thinking about setting up something in my name. A small fund for the church pantry that had helped me when times were hard. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at him and felt tears welling up. I told him I didn't need a name on a plaque or a title on paper, that the only gift I ever wanted was to see him walk in truth and kindness. He smiled, that real smile I hadn't seen since he was young, and said, "I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do." For the first time in years, I saw peace in his eyes. Not the kind that money buys, but the kind that comes from setting something right inside your soul. That night after he left, I sat by the window again, watching the snow fall beneath the streetlight, and whispered a prayer of thanks. Life hadn't been easy, and forgiveness hadn't come quickly. But as I looked out at the quiet world, I knew that every storm I'd endured had led to this stillness. The house no longer felt lonely, and neither did I. Love had found its way home, and even though nothing could erase the years of silence, the sound of his laughter now filled the spaces that once ached with emptiness. It reminded me that sometimes redemption doesn't arrive loudly. It comes softly, like snow falling on a roof, gentle but sure, covering everything that once felt broken. Spring arrived with quiet grace, melting away the last traces of snow, and the days began to stretch a little longer, carrying the soft hum of new beginnings. My son had started helping at the church pantry on weekends, something I never asked him to do, but it made my heart swell each time I saw him there, handing out food with a smile that came from somewhere genuine. The same place, I think, where his faith had been sleeping all those years. I'd watch from a distance sometimes, not to check on him, but just to marvel at how life has a way of mending what we think is lost. One small act of kindness at a time, he was building a new version of himself, one that didn't hide behind money or titles. We spent more evenings together now, sitting in the garden while the air smelled of lilacs, talking about everything and nothing all at once. He'd tell me about work, about how peace feels strange after years of chasing chaos, and I'd tell him that peace isn't found, it's learned. One night he said, "Mom, I finally understand what you meant when you said the church was keeping you alive. It wasn't just food, it was faith." I smiled, feeling the truth of that settle deep in me, and said, "Faith doesn't feed only the body, it feeds the soul, and that's the part we forget to nourish when life gets loud." Now, as I look back on it all, I see how everything had to happen exactly as it did for us to find our way here. The silence, the distance, the heartbreak, it all led to this peace that fills my home now like a soft hymn. I'm grateful, not just for what was restored, but for what was revealed. Love isn't about grand promises or expensive gifts, it's about the quiet moments that last long after the noise fades. Thank you, my dear ones, for staying with me until the end of my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Your kindness keeps this old heart warm, and I'll be here again soon with another story to keep you company.